Today, we're exploring the dynamics of leadership agility with Christian Wheeler, a professor at Stanford and renowned expert at merging psychology, marketing, and improvisation.
Christian's approach connects academic research with real-world practice, transforming how executives handle unpredictability and complexity in high-stakes settings.
We'll break down how cultivating behavioral flexibility and self-awareness can reshape leadership in today's ever-changing business landscape.
Plus, why embracing vulnerability and failure is essential for true growth.
Let's see what it means to master leadership in the face of uncertainty.
And how agility can become your greatest leadership asset.
Christian, you've explored such diverse fields: psychology, marketing, business, improv, and now leadership development. What made you jump between all these worlds? Is there something you're searching for, a core mission or a question that ties it all together?
My PhD is in social psychology, so I'm a social psychologist by training. But while I was at Ohio State pursuing my PhD, I took a number of marketing classes in their group, and I had known some people who had made the jump across disciplines. And so that connects the psychology to the marketing. And then the question is, well, what is this leadership agility class, and what does that have to do with any of the rest of it? I took a real detour to get involved in some of this. I had a sort of philosophical interest in the interactions that I was having with one another, with other people. And I was curious about what that magic is that creates real rapport and harmony between people and creates fascinating conversations that you're having with others. Just like what we're doing now, we're sort of creating something out of nothing in the sense that none of us knows exactly what's going to happen during this conversation. We're taking what each other gives us and adding little bits to it. And that's the essence of improvisational theater. And when I started exploring that and doing some performing myself and linking that to the things that I knew from the social psychological literature, I realized that social psychology can do a lot to explain both how improvisational theater principles work, but they can also do a lot to explain why our brains operate in certain ways and why a lot of those skills can be difficult for us, but also useful for us. And then I started bringing that into some of my teaching, and I realized that these same skills have incredible applicability to leadership and to business more generally. And when I started involving this in some of my teaching, I realized executives were getting incredible value from having some of these techniques along with the academic backbone to understand why they work and how they work and to unpack the kinds of mental experiences they had when they did it. And so, interestingly, I'm a social psychologist in a marketing group, and this class has nothing to do with marketing whatsoever.
Right. And, I'm thinking about that. You probably, right now it seems so normal, business and psychology, mix of improv and workplace. But I think that 10 years ago, it was an oxymoron. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I still think, one of the things that makes Stanford such a wonderful place to work and such a wonderful place for students to attend is that we have so many courses that allow people to take their unique backgrounds and to leverage their strengths to create courses that you won't find a lot of other places.
Christian, and how does this powerful mix of domains shape the way you teach and think of leadership?
Well, as I mentioned, the classes that I teach in leadership agility are very experiential. And they borrow from the types of things that you might see in some improvisational classes. But to that, they bring an academic underpinning, and they also relate those to the types of challenges that business leaders face, such as how to shape their interpersonal behavior to achieve their objectives, or to come up with breakthrough and innovative solutions, or how to manage their risk tolerance effectively.
That's very interesting. We're going to go into exercise that you practice with students. How do you define leadership agility, and why is this such a hot theme today?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think all of us have a set of mental processes and a set of behavioral outcomes from those processes that feel comfortable to us. They feel natural to us. They're things that we implement all the time. And that's all well and good. We probably have those approaches because they've worked for us in the past. But the issue is that leadership agility is critical because situations are inherently unpredictable. If you think about how most people operate both in their professional lives and in their personal lives, we plan all the time. We may have quarterly forecasts. We may have 5-year and 10-year goals for our personal lives. We also spend a lot of times, most of us in our head, rehearsing how a conversation is going to go to try to think about the things you're going to say to someone. You recognize, first of all, those plans are always wrong. Things never go exactly like we think they're going to. And furthermore, if you look at the evolution of our world today, you find that change is happening at an ever increasing pace. It is difficult to predict shorter and shorter time frames out because of the rapid evolution of change. And also in professional lives, people are asked to do increasingly hybrid jobs or to play multiple types of roles at their works. And so this requires a certain type of flexibility. And this flexibility is what I call leadership agility. This is a mental and behavioral flexibility to be able to adapt your approaches to the situation to maximize your outcomes in a situation. And so you can think of it in some ways from the interpersonal aspect of it as being like a character actor that has an incredibly broad range so that I can bring a wide array of responses to the situation depending on what's going to help me achieve my interpersonal goals. And then on the intrapersonal side, we have the same type of thing going on with our mental operations. This isn't to say that planning isn't important. And I think planning is an excellent thing to do. And I encourage everyone to do it. And in fact, excellent planning is one of those things that allows us to be comfortable being spontaneous. If you're prepared, you feel that you can handle a wide variety of situations. But the problem comes when we become too tied to our plans, too wedded to our plans. If you don't have an ability or a willingness to deviate from your plans, you're going to find that you're going to be ineffective in a lot of situations.
I'm thinking about that leadership agility challenges us to embrace spontaneous risks and fearless mindset. And there is definitely this mental flexibility involved, but it feels like more, there is something more, almost like leaders are tapping into their subconscious for making quick decisions. Would you say that intuition plays some role in this process?
Yeah, absolutely, it can. So one of the things we might talk about later is decoding nonverbal behavior. And so in that domain, for example, you find that both types of skills can be important in helping understand other people's behavior. So there's the known facts about the world. So for example, if you see someone, you're both nodding your heads, I might say, I know from what I read in a textbook that nodding your head kind of indicates agreement, or it can indicate other things like confidence and so forth. And so I might pull that explicit knowledge to help interpret your behavior. But it's also the case that we have something called implicit nonverbal knowledge, where I may have some sense of what you're thinking or what a certain response means. And there is an accuracy to that sense. Even if I can't explain exactly why I feel that way, you'll find that that also contributes to people's ability to decode nonverbal behavior accurately. And in fact, those things aren't very highly correlated with one another. And so I think both types of skills can be very important.
What's the recipe for leadership agility? What are the essential ingredients? Like, what does it consist of?
Yeah, well, so it incorporates this mental and behavioral flexibility. I can tell you about the modules that we talk about in the class, and these include things such as being comfortable with spontaneous situations and learning how to deal effectively with failure and to maximize the benefits from your failure. We talk about things such as creative problem solving, which involves not just coming up with ideas, but also evaluating the quality of ideas. We talk about learning how to listen very carefully so that you can uncover what seem like hidden psychological aspects of people, such as their underlying values and motivations. And we talk about some behavioral manifestations of this, such as the ability to modulate your nonverbal behaviors generally, but also how those play out in status behaviors. And then last, we talk about how all of these things can feed into our ability to relate to one another and to create rapport.
I'm happy to be a part of this course.
So, one of the ingredients you've mentioned is failure, right? And Yana and I often talk about how failure is critical to growth. And honestly, I feel like every entrepreneurship course touches down on the importance of failure. But at the same time, it's really difficult to develop this tolerance to failure. But let's start with why failure is so essential.
Yeah, well, failure is essential because unless you're failing, you are not operating at the outside limits of your abilities, right? So if you're going through your daily life and you never fail at anything, you're not pushing yourself hard enough, right? Because you're sticking in the routine, the comfortable, the things that you already know how to do. And so if you look at the difference often between amateurs and professionals in their skill development, what you find is that amateurs develop a certain set of skills and then they just ride those skills out. Whereas professionals are constantly seeking that outer edge of their performance. They're looking at that thing that they can't quite do yet, and they're working to overcome that limitation. And so failure, if we avoid failure, what that does is it prevents us from taking appropriate risks. It prevents us from growing as an individual, to expanding our zone of comfort, and to expanding our range of abilities.
Yeah, I love that phrase I found in course materials that good judgment comes from the experience and experience comes from bad judgment. That's exactly right.
Yes.
Christian, another ingredient of our dish is vulnerability, and we actually have a full episode dedicated to vulnerability and the benefits of self-disclosure at workplace with Carol Robin, and I encourage our listeners to definitely listen to it. But my question to you is, why do you think it's so counterintuitive for leaders to self-disclose at work? And what's your vision? How and why should we do that?
Yeah, well, I will say, I think vulnerability can mean multiple things. One type of vulnerability is what Carol was talking about, and I think that's critically important because vulnerability, or more precisely, self-disclosure, that form of vulnerability is what's critical for building trust in relationships. If you look at how relationships evolve from being complete strangers to acquaintances to close friends to infinite confidants, that happens through an escalating series of self-disclosures. And when we self-disclose to someone, what we're revealing to them is that I trust you enough to have this piece of information about me that not everyone knows. And that trust that I display in you is what creates that need for reciprocation, or that desire for reciprocation on your part. And these escalating, you can think of them as verbal trust falls, are what draw people closer together. And research shows, interestingly, that not only do I disclose to people that I like more, but that if you make me self-disclose something, I will like you more after I disclose to you than before, and that also you will like me more after I disclose than after. And a certain amount of self-disclosure can create new opportunities for people. For example, this entire class is something, and more generally, the notion that I was doing improvisational theater came from my own vulnerability, in the sense that when I started engaging in improv, I kept that very secret from my colleagues because it seemed like something that wasn't serious. It seemed like a little frivolous. And at that time in my life, I had a strict barrier between my personal life and my professional life. And since then, it's a very fluid barrier, and I've realized the real power of self-disclosure in creating opportunities. Because once I was open about this, it allowed me to see all of these connections that we talked about in the first part of this podcast. But there's another form of vulnerability that I think is important, and it's related to the failure thing. That we often have the feeling that we need to be perfect all of the time, and that we can't reveal the chinks in our armor, or we can't be seen to make mistakes in front of one another. If you are going to be successful in life, you have to have a willingness to be imperfect. Perfection is the enemy of the good. If you have a need to be perfect all the time, what that leads is to inaction and ossification, right? Because when we need to be perfect all the time, we avoid putting ourselves in situations of growth. And when we don't grow, we die. right? And so individuals and companies that are too risk averse, that are unwilling to be vulnerable, unwilling to allow the possibility of a mistake, get overtaken by more risk seeking competitors.
And we want to touch base on another part of the recipe, which is creativity and building with the materials you have, right? So this is something that you also cover in the course, and you talk a lot about this in your work. So what's the place of creativity in leadership agility?
Well, I'll reverse the question a little bit and talk about leadership agility, how it feeds into creativity. So, one of the things that you learn in the class is, and it's something that everyone knows is the first rule of improv, is this notion of yes and, right? The notion of taking an input from someone else, adding your own bit to that. And what you find through that process, if you practice it, is that you can come up with amazing creative solutions that you never would have been able to dream up on your own. And that act in itself requires both spontaneity, right? The idea that I'm not going to just do what improvisers call driving. I'm not going to have my vision and impose it on how you're going to think about it, but rather I'm opening myself up to whatever emerges in that situation, and a little bit of vulnerability as well. I'm allowing your ideas to infect me, you might say. I'm taking your ideas and they're changing me. But also, it requires that type of flexibility that we were just talking about. Creativity, by definition, is something that's different from what other people are doing, and it's also something different from what you've done before. And so it's a willingness to deviate from your own and other people's normal way of doing things. And to do that, you need a lot of different things to be successful. You need an appreciation of serendipity. You need a genuine curiosity about the world and an openness about the world, a desire to think about the unexpected things that you encounter. You need the flexibility to try out new ideas or to think about things from different perspectives, ways that are sometimes maybe even antithetical to the way you would normally approach a question. You need a willingness to question your assumptions. And the way that you're thinking about a problem. Sometimes even the definition, the way we define our problem, is not really the problem that we actually have. And of course, it requires a willingness to make mistakes, because a creative solution is not necessarily always going to work. And in fact, we often have to iterate multiple times on our creative solutions. But again, if you are risk avoidant, if you bring a sense of anxiety to creative situations, that's going to stifle your ability to try anything new. So creativity, by its definition, involves some type of risk and vulnerability.
I'm curious, is creativity, is it a cause or an effect of leadership agility?
It's a little bit both, I would say. It's a reinforcing relationship, right? And I feel like most things that you learn in this course are that way. For example, if you take something simple, just like the willingness to be spontaneous and to allow for serendipity, we often have to give ourselves a nudge to move in that direction, especially those more habit-bound or rule-bound among us. But once we do that and we find that, it's not so bad, that increases our propensity to do those things in the future. And so what you often find is that people who really do embrace the principles of the class and to allow them to affect multiple aspects of their lives, what you find is a real exponential curve, in the sense that these things really snowball on one another. It can be incredibly transformative for people.
Yes, like the first part was about like serendipity being such a Silicon Valley word. I feel like Yanni and I hear it from various people at least once per week, if not more. But I wanted to circle back to something that you mentioned about like fear of failure, right? And that it's really like it's impossible to be creative and do things in a new way if you're afraid of failure, right? And but fear can also like stifle creativity and inhibit it so much. And often, really, so many of us shy away from trying something new or taking creative risks because they worry about consequences. So how can we balance that fear? How can we create environments where we can take creative risks? Like how do we actually make choices to be less fearful and without this constant fear looming over us?
Well, I mean, one simple answer is to get used to failing in domains that aren't important or that don't have huge consequences, right? So obviously, not all mistakes are the same. A mistake on the operating table is not the same as a mistake when you're trying to learn a chord on the piano, right? So a lot of that psychological fear just comes from the notion that many of us impose this need to be perfect all the time on ourselves. We are often our own harshest critics. We often don't try things not just because other people might judge us, but because we imagine their judgment and often internalize it for ourselves. I think for a lot of people, this starts sometime in adolescence. I don't know if you have children, but if you spend time around children, you realize like children are not good at anything that they do. They fail all day long.
Okay. Right.
They're
And they
terrible
can
at
live with
everything.
it.
They don't know how to use a spoon. They don't know how to use a straw. They can't walk. They can't tie their shoes. They have terrible grammar. They're bad at everything, and they fail and don't care. They fall down and they just get back up and try again. Sometime for most of us, it's around adolescence when when other people start being cruel to us and judging us for being different, that we start to internalize this fear of not being perfect all the time. And a lot of us have trouble ever letting go of that adjustment. And so it just takes some training. Just do something that you're terrible at and get used to feeling terrible. And after a while, that feeling terrible doesn't feel so terrible anymore. You learn to do that. And then in these more high stakes situations, then you can take appropriate risks. Now, of course, the greater the negative consequences of a failure, then you need to, modulate that risk, of course, and to understand how much risk you're going to take. But you don't want this psychological fear of failure to be the determinant. You want to make an objective decision based on your assessment of the consequences, not just do it because you're afraid that you're going to look dumb. I think many of us too, at some point we stop trying new things and we just forget how long it takes to learn a skill. You think, oh, I'm going to learn to play guitar. And you do it, and it's difficult. And you're like, oh, this sucks. You imagine that I'm going to be playing songs for all my friends in a couple of days, and it just doesn't work that way. Any skill worth acquiring has a learning curve, and it takes time, but we forget what that learning feels like. And when we experience it, we often assume I'm doing something wrong, or I'll just never be good at this. Rather than just recognizing I just need to practice more.
Yeah, it's very interesting that we talk a lot about failure being a part of learning loop, right? It's already kind of a statement for the nowadays world, but still we somehow try to learn avoiding failing.
I feel like many of us, we're familiar with this Silicon Valley mantra of failing fast and all that. And that's easy for us to accept intellectually. But when we have a personal failure, it's difficult to get rid of that psychological sting.
We've talked about failure and developing this mindset, embracing failure, embracing fast and quick reaction and mental flexibility is a challenging skill to learn. In your view, how we can foster spontaneity in real time, and what practices? We've talked about improv a lot, and we also have a full episode on it with Matt Abrahams. However, we would love to know your perspective for spontaneity, which roles it play in creativity, and how we can actually become more spontaneous.
Yeah, well, in the domain of creativity, one major way that spontaneity feeds into that is that when you are trying to come up with inputs into your creative solutions, you often don't know where those are going to come from. But by definition, it almost certainly comes from some place that you're not normally looking. What I mean by that is whatever your industry in, the types of things that you think about in that industry as ways to innovate are almost certainly the same things that everybody else is thinking about. And many people define creativity as the linking of two things that other people have thought were unrelated and showing that they're actually related. That when you combine these two seemingly unrelated things, you come up with something new. And so then the question is, how do you come up with the unrelated thing? And how do you relate it to what you're doing? So, one key to that is a willingness to wander away from your focal goal. So you're trying to do X, but something catches your attention. And the reason it catches your attention is because you are paying attention and because you have that curiosity and openness that I was talking about before. You see something that just seems a little unusual or interesting. It catches your notice for some reason, and you're willing to say, hold on, I'm just going to go over here and think about this for a minute. And often, many inventions come from this diversion from what you're normally doing to pay attention to something unexpected. And that ends up being a breakthrough on a problem that maybe you weren't even working at in the first place. And so, one thing is a willingness to pay attention and a willingness to wander away from the thing that you're doing and to notice opportunities when they arise. Now, how do you notice opportunities when they arise? Well, this is another key part of leadership agility and a key part of spontaneity in particular is not allowing your expectations to dominate everything that you see. So much of the time, we see things and we just categorize them and let them go without really paying attention to them and having a curiosity about their nature. And when we can stop letting our expectations dominate our perception, we can often see the unique characteristics of things that can feed into our creative solutions. And so, one thing you can do is make a practice of looking for things that are unexpected and noticing them, and think about what you noticed and thinking about how is that related to a problem that I'm thinking about, or what is it that is curious about this situation. Another one is not cramming your days filled with no gaps, right? And so you can think about ways that you can foster spontaneity, again, in low stakes environments that are easy for us, even those of us who are more habit bound, to allow some of these possibilities to infiltrate. For example, maybe just try leaving a little part of the day open to see what happens. For example, I'm taking a trip to Paris soon. The Association for Consumer Research conference is there. I hope to do a little sightseeing. Now, many of us, when we have a little extra time on a trip, what we do is we cram our days filled with activities. I'm going to see the Eiffel Tower. I'm going to go to the Louvre. I'm going to go to this restaurant. That is not a recipe for spontaneity, right? You need to allow gaps. And as any visitor to Paris will tell you, often your best moments are wandering down some alleyway and encountering something that wasn't on your list. You can also practice this psychological aspect of it by trying not planning things in ordinary everyday situations. One very powerful thing that I recommend to people, and many people find it life-changing, is that when you are having a conversation with someone, don't plan what you're going to say. Think about how much of your situations where you're talking to somebody, they're still talking to you, but you're thinking about what you're going to say next. You're not really listening to them. You're rehearsing what you're going to say. Don't do that. Just listen to them and trust that when they stop talking, your mind is going to come up with something to say. And what you'll find is when you practice it, it will. And once you have that, now you know that you can trust your mind, because so much of why we're not spontaneous is, again, we fear the unknown. What if I don't have a plan for 10 minutes in Paris and I'm bored? What would happen then? What would happen if I just listened to you instead of planning what I was going to say and I couldn't come up with something to say? Wouldn't that be a tragedy? And you find out, no, it's not a tragedy. And second of all, it's probably not going to happen. And once you develop that trust, then again, your desire for spontaneity builds on itself. You realize, wow, that was actually much better than planning everything. I'd like to do that more.
I'm practicing your suggestion right away, right now. However, I want to say that, Christian, you are taking full responsibility for that. If I have nothing to say in some moment.
I accept my responsibility.
Great. Now we're all psychologically safe.
I think this is an amazing exercise. Yeah, and like Yana, I was trying not to plan what I'm going to say, but I still had this question prepared before, so I will ask it. And except for because this exercise is brilliant. do you have other, like, especially with your background in improv, right? Because I feel, again, improv, it's something that Yana and I heard about at Stanford mostly, and then like suddenly everyone around us does it or practices it, or like even I taken a class and loved it. So the question is, do you have any other exercises that can help people become more spontaneous and in real time?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, a very simple game. It's a game you can play with your friends, and something that improvisers do in improv classes all the time is to try to think of examples of members of categories as quickly as you can. Right. So I could play this game with you and Yana. I won't ask you to do it, but I'd say, okay, I'd like you to name as many types of fruits as you can, and you alternate going. Juliana says one, Yana goes, and you go back and forth. It's very rapid. If you stall too long, you lose. Right? You have to think on your feet. What you realize is that this is cultivating multiple abilities. First of all, it's cultivating your ability to engage in divergent thinking. Right? You're thinking of lots of solutions to a stimulus, which is this is a common creative exercise that people use to test people's creativity. But you're also, more importantly, you're putting your mind under the kind of stress that is useful for developing the skills necessary for leadership agility. That um, so much of or difficulty in engaging in tasks like this is not about doing the thing itself. It's again about overcoming these mental barriers to doing it. And what happens when you do a speeded task like this, where you need to think on your feet and there's pressure, I'm going to point you out if you don't come up with an answer fast enough, Juliana. What we find is that that mental stress interferes with our ability to think in the moment. And so when we get accustomed to that, it's just in the same way that you might exercise your muscles or your cardiovascular fitness, you're putting your body under stress in a structured situation so that when you're in real life, you're already used to that stress. And now climbing the stairs is no problem because you did your cardio all last week. In the same way, adapting your mind to this mental stress makes it more skilled at handling those situations, such that now when you're in a new situation like that, and it matters, you're handling a difficult Q&A in front of a hostile audience, or you need to advise someone on what to do right this moment because they need to make a decision, your mind is already used to that. And so it can relax in the moment and operate in an efficient way rather than you adding all of these other layers that are not useful to your problem solving in that moment.
You know, it reminds me right now, I have this insight about my surf classes in Hawaii. When my surf teacher was teaching me, you know, he was engaging me in conversation right after the wave is already, you know, touching me. And then he said, this is yours, go. All the time, each time he keeps doing like this. And I'm saying, why you keep doing like this? I want to be prepared for the wave. And he says, you want to be prepared for the ocean? You have to learn how to be spontaneous to be prepared.
Yeah. You need
And
to
that's
catch
how
that wave when it comes.
Right. Because the only way to be prepared for the ocean is to be able to be spontaneous, whatever it takes.
Yes. I love it. Yeah.
Luck, we wanted to actually, this is a fascinating angle looking at luck that we find in course materials. And you've described luck as a skill that can actually be learned and cultivated. How does this idea of luck relate to leadership agility and how we can practice luck?
Yeah, well, luck is related to a lot of things that we talked about, such as the ability to be spontaneous, the ability to capitalize on serendipity, you know, and like a lot of these things, what you find is that what seems like something that just happens on its own is something that you can actually manufacture in a sense, you know. So there's this fascinating book on luck by Richard Wiseman, where he studied the characteristics of people who identify themselves as lucky. For example, there are certain people, and I guess this is a statistical necessity in some sense, but people who win far more lotteries and raffles and prizes than other individuals. And you might ask yourself, what makes them so lucky? How do they win all of these? Well, a simple answer that he found is that they tend to enter more lotteries and raffles and so forth. They are seeking those opportunities and they create them. And they also create them interpersonally. That lucky people, they smile more, they have more open gestures, they seek social connections. So you may find someone who says, boy, you wouldn't believe my luck. I was going on sabbatical and I needed someone to rent out my apartment. And I just happened to be on a plane sitting next to someone who was coming to Stanford for the exact time I was gone. What are the odds of that? And as it turns out, well, for that person, the odds of that are actually quite high because everybody they run into, they're striking up a conversation with. They find that that person's going, oh, what are the odds? So they create those opportunities by fostering those social connections. They also create those opportunities by being observant. They notice those opportunities when they come about because they're looking for them and they expect them to happen. And so this is related to that attention and noticing behavior that I was talking about before. And then also the ability to see the good and the bad. So we talked about how creativity often comes from noticing something that is maybe a disruption of what you were working on or something that's unexpected from something that you were working on. If you look at so many Silicon Valley success stories, they're based on pivots. Well, what is a pivot? A pivot is when I was doing something, it wasn't working, I wasn't gaining traction, but I recognized I had the curiosity about something that seemed like it had potential, a willingness to deviate from my plan to go and do something else. And a lot of those things look like real luck, but it's really just a systematic series of mental processes where they're creating their own luck.
So there is no hope for random luck anymore, right?
Well, there
Once again,
certainly
to
is.
lucky, you have to put effort in this.
Well, yeah, but you put effort into getting the randomness. I mean, if you think about so many things that are wonderful in our lives are also things that inhibit serendipity. As a very simple example, when I want to get a piece of information, I use a search engine to get it. And search engines are increasingly effective, quite effective, at giving me exactly what I want. But the problem is when I'm looking for information, sometimes what I think I want isn't exactly what I really want. I don't know what I want. And people who are my age have the memory of having to go to the library looking for a book on the shelf, and you find that the book that I was looking for, I knew the book I wanted, but the book that I really wanted was a book that was next to it on the shelf. So when I'm searching for my book, I find something kind of close that is actually much more interesting and much more related to what I really wanted. But I didn't even know that that book existed, and I didn't know that that was the key I was looking for. And so, there can be a real cost to being too efficient and too direct. Not because we don't get what we want, but because we do get what we want and we don't allow that serendipity to happen. And so allowing that serendipity, that process itself is random or, it's serendipitous, at least it's not my control. But the part that is under my control is creating the conditions that allow it to happen.
I mean, I find this conversation so insightful, and I feel like I will be really listening to it on repeat. I don't want to sound random, but again, I want to really get your opinion on this because as a person who easily gets excited, right? So once this opportunity come to me, once I noticed these connections and they make them happen. You also uncover the concept of positive skepticism, right? And it's such an interesting idea. So how can leaders cultivate this balance between embracing creativity while also maintaining healthy skepticism, especially when it comes to making big decisions?
Well, I think it's very important to distinguish between the jobs that need to be done at various steps of the creative process, right? I mean, what we've been talking about is all about coming up with ideas, about entertaining possibilities, about getting inputs. But a key component of the creative process is evaluating those inputs. And in my class, we talk about a number of systematic ways you can separate the good from the bad. But I would say, what's important is not to try to do those things at the same time. And so we often inhibit our ability to come up with ideas because we're evaluating them at the same time. These are both jobs that we need to do, but I think they need to be done at separate parts of the process. But you're right that when I'm deciding what to do, deciding what to implement, I need to be very critical I want to still be constructive, but I want to be critical. I want to think about how things can go wrong. I want to think about how things are impractical, maybe from a time perspective or a money perspective. But even at that stage, I want to think about the good aspects of that as well. Maybe my idea as I formulated it is not great, but this aspect of it could be incorporated into a better idea and leveraged out that way. And so we need to be, and this is another part of this flexibility, right? That I feel like some of us are pie in the sky dreamers. We have a wonderful ability to come up with crazy ideas and no reality check on those ideas. Others of us are the hard nosed skeptics all the time. We criticize everything. We're very good at thinking about what's wrong with all of the ideas. Both of those are necessary. And part of your agility is to be able to move back and forth between those roles. And we talk about in the class systematic processes that you can use both for yourself or for the people that you're leading, how you can bring those roles in when they're useful and put them away when they're not useful.
What is the first thing here to be actually to be able to switch in between conflicting hats? Whatever it is, right now, agility versus, creativity versus positive skepticism and things like that. So leadership agility, to my mind, is something, it's a place in between of those conflicting domains, right?
The agility is the ability to switch between those two, yeah.
Right. So what is the first skill there? To be able to switch, actually? Is it a belief? Is it awareness? Maybe that you have options?
Well, the first step there, I think, is broadening your ability to think about things in different ways. And so the way the class is structured, I guess, first we start out with spontaneity and failure. And so you get used to some amount of mental discomfort. And then we get into working with teams. And I think working in teams is where you begin to play around with these ideas, right? You start to learn how to incorporate other people's ideas and to let your ideas set aside, or rather to have your ideas have an equal weight in the process rather than having your ideas dominate those. And just in that very process, what I'm learning to do is to incorporate your perspective into my own instead of letting my normal way of doing things dominate everything. And when I'm engaging in that process, that forces me to be accepting of ideas rather than rejecting them out of hand. And so I think the first step for many of us is just getting used to that acceptance and that building. I feel like most of the leaders I come across are better at saying no than at saying yes. And of course, in our jobs, we have to say no to all kinds of requests, and we need to be able to say no. But we don't want to say no reflexively, and we don't want to say no because that's the only thing we know how to do. We want to be able to say yes, to be able to build ideas, and to understand the situations in which each of those is the appropriate thing to do.
One last question, which is a regular and recurring question for the mastery talks. What's one key takeaway you would share for our listeners about leadership agility and what to start from in developing it?
Yeah, well, I guess one refrain I talk about a lot in the class, and I think I already mentioned it here today, is getting comfortable being uncomfortable. Whether that uncomfortability is moving outside of your comfort zone to be more spontaneous, whether that being uncomfortable is allowing yourself to fail and to take risks, whether that discomfort is just changing your habitual way of thinking about things and doing things. I feel that many people find we're so used to avoiding discomfort in all ways in our lives that it's too easy for us to do, and we become overly afraid of discomfort. And we view discomfort as a bad thing, when discomfort is often a sign that you're doing something wonderful for yourself. To link it back to physical exercise again, just in the same way that you shouldn't get off the treadmill the moment it feels difficult. That difficulty is actually a sign that you're doing something right. If it doesn't feel difficult, you're not doing it right. the more you can put yourself in situations where you feel a little bit out of your comfort zone, things feel a little unusual or different to you, you don't quite know if you're doing the right thing, the more you become habituated to that feeling. Now, if you're, for example, many people they feel awkward public speaking, right? I don't want to give a talk in front of audience. For many people, that feeling never goes away. You're still anxious giving a talk. I was a little nervous coming on this podcast. That's fine. But you want to be comfortable with that discomfort. You want to be comfortable with that anxiety. And I feel where a lot of us go wrong is that we add on to that with all these other mental processes. But the more we can put ourselves in those stress situations, those feelings of discomfort or feeling unusual, the more adapted to them we are. And that's our beginning step into becoming a truly agile leader.
So to sum it up, Christian walked us through his fascinating journey blending psychology, marketing, improv, and leadership.
We explored leadership agility, how being mentally and behaviorally flexible helps leaders adapt to unpredictable situations.
Christian shared how embracing creativity, intuition, and even failure builds agility and pushes leaders to grow through discomfort.
And we discussed how openness to spontaneity and unexpected opportunities can lead to breakthrough ideas and solutions.
Overall, the leadership agility is more than just a skill. It's a mindset for thriving in today's fast-paced world.
Practice letting go of certainty. Sometimes the best discoveries come from being willing to improvise and adapt.
If today's conversations resonated with you, be sure to subscribe and join us next time.